I just wanted to cover off a few things for the IPA generally before we do that. You know that you're all here because you share our vision of a free Australia, a free people, and our purpose is securing that freedom for the next generation. We can only do it because of 8,000 plus members like yourself around Australia, people who share the values that we hold so dear, share our concerns about the direction of the country. I was going to mention that the last time I gathered with the group of members in Sydney, I said that there were three immediate priorities for us at the moment. There was net zero, and there was education and young people, and of course the voice to Parliament, which we'll come to tonight. Because we do want to get the complexities of the voice out, we have three quite different speakers, I think, bringing perspectives. Because we want to bring it all out, and each of them is very, very well qualified to do so. And I think we are actually modelling the kind of respectful debate that we should be having in Australia, rather than being actually told that there's no detail worth talking about. Our first speaker is should be well known to you all, being Amanda Stoker. Welcome, Amanda. So, thank you. You all know Amanda from her political career, and many of you will also know that before that she had a distinguished legal career and also had a period as a judge's associate to the great Justice Ian Callanan when he was on the High Court, and I couldn't think of a better mentor to have there. Amanda also spoke to our IPA function in Brisbane, which I was very grateful for. Thank you, Amanda. And we had Gary Johns there because we are working with all organisations who share our interest in this issue, and with Warren Mundine at the Recognise a Better Way, there is a group working very actively on this as well. Our second speaker is Dr Anthony Dillon, who joins us from Australian Catholic University, where he is a researcher at the Institute for Positive Psychology and Education. He has a PhD in psychology and has research interests in positive psychology, the conceptualisation of mental health, wellbeing, and Aboriginal education. It says on the website he is an active social commentator on Aboriginal issues, and that's putting it mildly, a forceful, articulate, and I think sensible voice on a whole range of social policy issues, and that's a space that he's been occupying long before this idea of the voice came about, and that's the perspective I think Anthony brings to us. He also has, I think, possibly the only Twitter feed in the country which actually makes you think better about life and actually is a source of common sense and reason. So thank you, Anthony, for being with us tonight. And both Amanda and Anthony, by the way, have chapters in this excellent book edited by Peter Curti and Warren Mundine, which is a collection of essays on the voice called Beyond Belief. If you would like to get a copy and get the authors to sign it, Anthony Capello will be able to help you afterwards. Our final speaker is with the IPA, John Storey. He's also been a practicing lawyer and indeed was managing partner of his own law firm. But the law's loss was Australia's gain when John decided that there were bigger challenges out there, nothing less than saving Australia. He joined the IPA as a research fellow and is now the director of the Legal Rights Program. He's been working very closely with Morgan Begg and Dan, of course, on the voice to date. He's also a man of parts. In his spare time, he wrote a book called Big Wars. Why do they happen and when will the next one be? So you can engage him about that if you like. His research had immediate impact, including, by the way, the issue of the pamphlet, which may have been resolved in Canberra today. A small victory, but an important one, because as I say, anything that puts real information in the hands of mainstream Australians will I think, lead them to the view that the voice is not a great idea. So the way we'll work is 10 minutes for each speaker, then we'll have a Q&A discussion afterwards. And then afterwards, we won't be serving any more drinks out there. The staff aren't available, but I believe that we can retire to the foyer downstairs and maybe have a drink and a bit of a chat there as well. But without further ado, I'll ask first of all Amanda and then Anthony and John to speak to us about the Voice to Parliament.
Hello everyone, and thank you very much for the opportunity to be with you tonight. Scott and everyone at the IPA, you're always a joy to work with, and both in and out of the parliamentary role, the work you do is essential. It keeps your politicians educated, but importantly, you're like the little angel that sits on their shoulder, reminding them to be the best versions of themselves, and it's a very special thing. Sundays with Stoker, 6 p.m, Queensland time, 7 p.m. here. There you go. Often has wonderful guest, Anthony Dillon, hoping to get John Storey. Had Daniel Weil just the other day. All good. Now, on to more important things. Look, you will have all seen that the way that the arguments in favour of constitutionally entrenching a voice to Parliament are being run consists of almost weaponising the goodwill of Australians for their Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander brothers and sisters against them. And that should really concern us and, in a sense, offend us, because Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people deserve better than that, but so too do the people who we are asking to vote upon it. And so I'm going to touch on a couple of reasons why this proposal is problematic. The first is on the grounds of equality. Fundamentally, it is a really troubling idea that we might allow Australia's constitution to countenance different democratic rights for different Australians on the basis of the colour of their skin or their cultural identity. That's not the principle on which this country was founded. But even if we were prepared to revisit the principles on which this country was founded, we know from our understanding of history and the systems that work and do not work around the world that as soon as you start to break down the body of citizenry into groups of people with different rights, particularly on the basis of attributes over which they have no control, you are very quickly on the path to tyranny, to social unrest, and to citizens turning on one another. That's a very troubling thought. It is in many ways a manifestation of the obsession with identity politics, to which I'll come a little more in a moment. It should be opposed also on the basis of efficacy. I mean, so much of the arguments that are run in support of the Voice to Parliament come down basically to this. We've tried a lot of other stuff over a lot of years and it hasn't worked, so this must be it. And one, that's a terrible basis upon which to change one's constitution, spend public dollars, or play with the lives of Aboriginal Australians, because it's predominantly the people we're talking about, as though they are just toys to be used in a game of public policy. But the last time we tried something like this, it was called ATSIC. And it worked out rather badly for those who remember it. It cost a lot, it didn't achieve its goals, it was racked by corruption, and in many ways, the best thing that could be done to it was what John Howard did, and that was to bring what had become a really poisonous Aboriginal industry rather than a way of representing and hearing and delivering for Aboriginal people and showing at the door. Another reason why we should have cause to doubt the efficacy of a body like this is to say that with a body like this being placed into the Constitution, we face the very real prospect that this will operate, to use words that I think Scott used a moment ago, be akin to throwing sand in the gears of government. And by that I mean this. At the moment we already have a whole host of bodies set up by different parts of government, different legislative bodies that are all about consulting with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people about tailoring policies in ways that will work best for local communities. Sometimes that works well, sometimes it doesn't. But we have a lot of them already in place. If you were to make that constitutionally entrenched, what you get instead is a requirement, whether it's framed as consultative or having something of a veto, an arrangement whereby if you don't get the tick off of this group called the Voice, what you instead do is open up so many avenues for judicial review of the work of Parliament that if you think it's hard to get something through the Senate now and get it into law, you ain't seen nothing yet if you're also going to bring in a judicial layer. But there's something more repugnant about it than that. Parliamentarians, for all of their flaws, and I don't suggest for a moment that we are flawless, at least we're accountable. Every 4 years, or 3 years, depending on the level of government, you get the chance to tell us what you think. And if that means giving us the old heave-ho, well, so be it. But you don't get that with your judges. And yet, this proposal would put the opportunity for judges to have the final say on the work of Parliament above that democratically elected and accountable group. That's something that should be problematic for all of us. And finally, the third reason I'd say we should approach this with great caution is to say it's an inflexible way of dealing with the problem. Given we don't know precisely the right answer for all Indigenous groups and all problems that they face, and indeed that makes a lot of sense. Different communities have different needs in different places. It would be a mistake to entrench in the Constitution a model that couldn't be adjusted or tweaked in the event that for some reason you found it wasn't working. The requirement to go to a referendum and achieve a majority of people in a majority of states in order to change even just one word of the Constitution and all of the public expense that involves means saying yes to this is to adopt the least flexible way to try and solve the problems facing Aboriginal Australia. And in circumstances where the approach seems to be, we don't know why nothing else worked, so this must be it, that seems like a very poor logical foundation upon which to implement a highly inflexible arrangement that constrains the ability to innovate and try new things that might help to bring prosperity and freedom and social flourishing to some of our particularly remote communities. They're the three main reasons. But I think if we step back, there's an important question to ask here, and it's this. What do you want your Constitution to do? If you want Australia's Constitution to offer you peace with history and a sense of healing and a feeling of comfort with the past, what you need is a psychologist. Truly, the Constitution is a legal document that mechanically and dispassionately allocates the responsibilities and duties of the federal government as compared to the states. That's it. Sets up the three branches of government. It is the least emotional document you will ever find. And so, if you expect the Constitution to make you feel whole, you're going to be very, very disappointed. Now, I say that with a bit of levity, but I acknowledge there are aspects of our history that are imperfect. I'm happy to observe that in the process of implementing a range of policies over time, some pretty rotten things have been done to our Aboriginal brothers and sisters. But confronting that reality, being honest about it, and real and decent to those people of an Aboriginal background who find that problematic, does not necessitate the distortion of our constitution in ways that it was never intended for, but also could never succeed in delivering upon. I've mentioned this principle of equality as being important to the way that we should approach this. There's something, I hesitate to use the word racist, right, because it gets bandied around in a lot of ways, and even in this campaign, the number one way to shut down a person who might have a few doubts about whether or not this is the right thing to do is to throw the R word at them, and then everybody cowers and goes home. But there's something fundamentally racist about the assumption that all Aboriginal people think the same. You only need to look at the Parliament for 5 minutes to see Lydia Thorpe, Jacinta Price, Linda Burney. I could keep going, but you've got 3 Aboriginal women just there. Very different worldviews, very different values, and very different ideas of what the future for all Australians should look like. And yet we want to proceed on the basis that there is one Indigenous voice and that it can speak for all of the different needs of the men and the women and the children and the different requirements that we face in Cherbourg versus Alice Springs versus Redfern. If you look at the data that exists about the way Aboriginal people are tracking as against the rest of our community, you'll notice that there's actually about 80% of Aboriginal people who are doing as well as you or I by the measure of wealth, employment, housing, health, expected lifespan, all of these big measures. About 80% of our Indigenous Australians are actually doing pretty well. 20% are doing really badly. Those 20% overwhelmingly are based in very remote places. What the left is so determined to craft as an issue of race could very well be understood as one of geography. That our rural and regional and remote Australians face challenges that are very different and very great as compared to our urban ones. But that doesn't suit the narrative of those who drive this notion that we should be separating Australians by race. And it presents a real risk, in my view, to our social cohesion for the long term. My good friend, no doubt she's a good friend to all of you, Jacinta Price, said that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And those who push this agenda seek to take those good intentions and weaponise them against Australians, to manipulate them and to put in place a structure that would fundamentally undermine the ability of Australian neighbours to value one another for who they are and for what they do and for the things that we overcome and accomplish and achieve together, and substituted with this identity politics-based framework that incentivises victimhood, discourages initiative, and provides people with every reason in the world to find excuses for underperformance rather than encouraging all of us to build one another up to overcome. That corrosiveness of identity politics is real, and it leaves its destruction wherever it goes. I feel very strongly about Australia's constitution because I know that it has set us up as a country for a greater period of peace and prosperity. You think about it, in the over 200 years of this nation, we haven't once had civil war. It's a very rare thing in the world, but it has set us up for greater peace, stability and freedom and prosperity than just about anywhere else in the world. It's not something that should be messed with lightly. It shouldn't be messed with on the basis that is simply a reflection of running out of ideas. There is, however, one kind of amendment to the Constitution that would be acceptable, but it's not on the table, and that is to remove the one remaining reference to race. There is, at the moment, a recognition still in this Constitution, even despite all the good work that was done in 1967, to set up different laws for some Aboriginal people. And that's used for things like native title and the like. But Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people aren't different Australians. They aren't lesser Australians. They are just the same as all of us, to be valued for the goodness within. And so an amendment to remove that would be worthwhile. But that's not what's on the table right now. What's on the table is something much, much more corrosive. Scott's right to say we don't actually know all that we need to about what's proposed by the Albanese government here. But what we do know is that the scope of topics that it is designed to cover is quite broad. We were told initially that it was to cover matters relevant to the lives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. That sounds fair enough, but most people assumed that just meant cultural heritage and native title laws. Well, assuming that is actually pretty crummy too, because an Aboriginal person just has exactly the same interest in tax law, environmental law, school education, hospitals. All of the things that matter to you also matter to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And to think that they would only have an interest in matters relating to native title and cultural heritage is itself pretty demeaning. So we don't know the full scope of what this model is meant to cover. But chances are it's going to have a say on every area of policy, from the social to the economic and everything in between. There's been a bit of argy-bargy over whether it's to cover just the work of Parliament or also be a voice to the executive. It seems like Albanese's reined that in a little in recent times. But either way, he's made it very clear, and I think he's right about this, it will be a brave government that rejects the submissions of the so-called voice to Parliament. And when that is factored in the work of courts, in the work of parliaments, and in the work of the media, it will make it well nigh impossible for anything to get done in this country without the tick-off of what will ultimately become our third chamber. That's an outcome that harms all of us, but it particularly harms Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people by denying their individuality, their creativity, their unique talents and gifts as individual human beings and treating them like they're some sort of undifferentiated mass. And that ultimately is the philosophical reason for rejecting it. Because we know that the greatest human dignity comes from recognising that spark of individuality and uniqueness in each and every one of us, because that's what allows each of us to make our unique contributions that together make a society prosper. Plenty more to say on it. We'll do that in question time. But I, with pleasure, hand over to one of those very talented, gifted, creative, unique Aboriginal people I speak so highly of in you, Anthony Dillon.
Oh, thank you very much, and thanks for a great intro, talk, opening, Amanda. Everything, I loved what you said. My favourite bits were the bits which I was going to talk about now, but so I'm going to have to think quickly on my feet. So I agree with so much of what you said. Yeah, look, I've been thinking about Aboriginal affairs for over 25 years, and what I see today with The Voice is what I've been talking about for all this period, and that is, I believe the commonalities between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people far outweigh the differences, and that's what I've always gone on about, saying that there's so much in common. That's not to say that that 20% live in very different circumstances, and those circumstances need to be addressed. But Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people have the same fundamental needs, and that should be the starting point. I think the starting point for The Voice, although they haven't said it explicitly, is Aboriginal people have very different fundamental needs to non-Aboriginal people. So that's a major concern. And when it's sold to us, I hear this term self-determination a lot, which is, we've heard for decades. We need a voice. We need Aboriginal voices to speak on behalf of Aboriginal people and here's what I think is the crucial thing, and the bit I disagree with so much, because only Aboriginal people can fully understand Aboriginal people. And I think that is so damaging, okay? If you're if you're a non-Aboriginal person, let's turn it around. If you're a non-Aboriginal person and you go to, you've got a toothache, you go to the dentist, do you really care if the dentist is Aboriginal? You would just hope that he's qualified or she's qualified, okay? So my point is, just as Aboriginal people can help non-Aboriginal people, so can non-Aboriginal people help Aboriginal people. And I think that has been what has kept, say, that 20%. That's been a big factor. That's kept that 20% down for so many decades, that there's been this assumption we've got to have Aboriginal people because only they can understand the needs of Aboriginal people. Well, they have the same needs. Yes, the circumstances are different, but you don't have to be of a particular culture to understand those needs. The basic needs, a roof over your head, fresh food, and then, of course, in the 21st century, access to a good education and the ability to provide service to those around you, those in your community, which in most cases often is a job. Not always, but a job is one of the good ways of doing that. And so that's what's needed. And yes, as Amanda pointed out, we have very much the problem is not so much Aboriginal versus non-Aboriginal people, but it's that rural remote distinction. And I can remember Nicholas Rothwell in The Australian wrote an article many years ago when he was talking about Tony Abbott's vision for Aboriginal Australia. And he said it's about place, not race. Okay, so yes, if you put 100 white people in an area where they're cut off from the rest of the society, there's very few job opportunities, there's going to be problems. Okay, so, beg your pardon? Yeah. So we need to look at, what are the problems, what needs addressing, and to me, it's not a cultural problem. Now, let me qualify something. I have no problem with Aboriginal services, okay? And there's many good ones, and I've been associated with many of them. And they're full of competent people. There are many that aren't competent, but there are many that are full of competent people. And if Aboriginal people want to use those services, that's great. But they should not be forced into it, and they should not be led to believe that self-determination is when you go and receive a service from someone of your culture, okay? Applied to a group level, to a collective level, self-determination loses its meaning, but it has been sold as, when we have this Indigenous voice, this Aboriginal voice speaking for Aboriginal people, that will be self-determination. Now, self-determination is when, as an individual, you decide to improve your life. So I might decide to go to the gym, get healthy. Yes, I get help from people of different cultures, but as an individual, I'm deciding to make an effort. So it doesn't matter who gives me the help, so long as they're competent. That's self-determination, when individuals make decisions that are going to improve their lives. We keep hearing, well, we need, shouldn't Aboriginal people have a voice? Well, they already do. It's the mainstream politicians, but if you want to say, well, we need something a bit more than that, there already are many organisations. We know this, I'm not telling you anything new. And people say, yes, but it hasn't worked, as Amanda pointed out. And one of the reasons why I think it hasn't worked is because, one, there's been that assumption that, well, to help Aboriginal people, you can only get Aboriginal people, and we have special ways and different needs, etc., which is just nonsense. But also there's been a focus and emphasis on, the woke sort of stuff, the symbolism, changing street names, getting coon cheese banned, and, those sorts of things, which really doesn't help Aboriginal people in any practical way. Now, I'm not completely against symbolism. That's fine. If people want to have celebrations and flags and parades, that's fine. But we should not dismiss the practical needs or assume that those practical needs, bread, water, shelter, etc., can only be met by someone of your culture. So, to call this as an expression of self-determination, which is what a lot of people are buying into it as, is wrong. And you'll notice so far, I'm halfway through my speech, and I haven't mentioned anything about the Constitution, and I don't plan to, because there are more informed people, legal eagles, who know about this sort of thing. So I keep away from that. And I want to make the point that even before you start talking about constitutions, which does need to be talked about, but by qualified people, and you've got Amanda, you've got Greg Craven, Janet Albertson, you've got a lot of people on both sides talking about this, and we should listen to them. But I'm saying, even before we get to the stage of tinkering with the Constitution, I'm not for some sort of official thing called the voice. It will be seen as another silver bullet, much like the apology to the stolen generations. People thought this was going to be a game changer. It was not. And I said it wasn't. I wasn't against the apology. I just said it's not going to change anything. And I think that this will be seen as another game changer, which it simply will not. So what I think, if we have this formal structure, body, called the voice, which we don't know the detail of yet, all it will do is continue the things that I spoke about that I'm opposed, changing the name of a certain product. For goodness sake, one of my favourite biscuits when I was a kid were Gollywog biscuits. Okay. In my family, there's there's people they call each other Gollywog, big Gollywog and little Gollywog, because when I do have long hair, it's like Amanda's. And the term gollywog, I'm going on a tangent here, but my point is, I think if we have this formal thing called the voice, we will just see more of the same thing. With ATSIC, its defenders would probably say, oh yes, but government did this, wouldn't let us do this, had a few problems. And if we iron out those problems, I think you'd just be getting more of what I'm saying, focusing on changing street names, indigenising curriculums, whatever that means, decolonising places, whatever that means. You're going to see more of that, but it'll just have a bit more weight behind it, okay, which is what we don't need. So, certainly I can't see this formal thing called the voice making much of a difference. We just need to make sure that that roughly 20% of Indigenous people who are suffering have ready access to the same opportunities that the other 80% have, and in particular, the proponents of the architects of the voice, those Indigenous leaders who I respect them for their achievements. Obviously I disagree with their stance on the voice, but I do respect them for their achievements. They're high achievers, and they've done it without the voice. So they should be using their voice to say to people in remote areas, hey, here's what you've got to do. Okay? And just very, very briefly, you for that 20%, or well, for anyone to make it, if we just look at Indigenous Australians, generally speaking, there's two things. You're either born into good circumstances, like I was, and so two good parents who set a great example for me. Most of you would know who my father was. Okay, if you don't, read The Weekend Australian. Big story about him. High achiever, Aboriginal man, who never sort of built his life around being Aboriginal, which is why I never did the same thing either. And a mother who equally contributed to me. But so you're born into good circumstances like I was, or you escape bad circumstances, and usually with a helping hand. And I like to think in Australia, in Aboriginal Australia, there's not one Aboriginal person who doesn't have access to a helping hand, someone who could help them. There is plenty of help that would be given to them to pull them out of those bad circumstances. So that's what needs to be done, rather than this formalised thing called the voice. I just want to give you a couple of quotes that I've, from this book that's out the front. You've seen it. Amanda and I are in there, and Tony Abbott's got a great chapter. Really good chapters in here. But I've quoted two other people. One person, Martin Luther King, and there's one quote that he's always well known for, and I haven't used that one here. I've used another quote. Let me just read this. Since we are Americans, so he's talking of both black and white Americans. Since we are Americans, the solution to our problems will not come through seeking to build a separate black nation, but by finding the creative minority of the concern from the oft-times apathetic, etc., etc. So, seeing them as one. And then another Aboriginal politician, or former politician, Alison Anderson, from the Northern Territory, said, "We Indigenous people need to be like other Australians. I do not mean we should abandon our beliefs or our language, but like dozens of other cultures in Australia, we must learn to combine our own identities with participation in the broader society. It will not weaken us." And we know that there are many other cultures who get on well. They've learnt what they've needed to learn in order to function in Australia, but they still maintain their culture. So it's not about getting rid of culture. It's about literally saving the people so that they can practice their culture if they want to, but so that they can participate in mainstream society as equals. As I come to a close with my part, there's other parts to this whole thing, the Uluru Statement. There's the treaty and truth and that sort of thing. We've seen what a mess, a nightmare, and the confusion surrounding the voice already before it's even gone to referendum. Okay, it's very, very messy. We would all agree with that. I believe when it comes time to a treaty, the mess will be 1,000 times messier than what we've got right now. So again, getting in ahead of the game, a treaty certainly isn't the solution either. The architects of the voice that I spoke about, they've achieved what they've achieved without a treaty. We know what works. We know what it's all about closing the gap. And as I keep saying too, it's not the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. It's the gap between that 20% and that group. Like, I'm in that group that are doing reasonably well. And by that, I mean, I know where my next meal's coming from. I live in a safe home and that sort of thing. So yes, in conclusion, Indigenous people already have voices and representation. I'm not saying get rid of them, although some of them I would like to get rid of, but let's keep them there. But they should be focused on the basics, focusing on the things we know that works. So I cannot think of anything, and I'd be, if someone come to me and said, "Anthony, this is what the voice will allow or enable to happen that can't happen now, that will help Aboriginal people," I would probably consider it. But I cannot think of anything that we cannot do now, because we have seen the proof. Many, many successful Aboriginal people are living amongst us, with us, not separate to us, just with us. So that's my view on the voice.
Hi everyone, thanks for coming. Tonight I'll start off by talking about some of the IPA's work on international comparisons, what we can learn overseas about this great experiment we are about to embark upon. And I came across a proposal to amend the United States Constitution. This proposal was put forward by a Mr. Ibram X. Kendi. You may have heard of him. He wrote the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. What is anti-racism? It's another word for racial equity, which is itself just a rebadging of the word communism. Racial equity requires that all outcomes, whether it's in terms of income, wealth, admission to university, incarceration in prison, directors on boards of companies, all outcomes in society between racial groups must be equal. In 2019, Kendi wrote the following: "To fix the original sin of racism, Americans should pass an anti-racist amendment to the US Constitution. The amendment would make unconstitutional racial inequity over a certain threshold, as well as racist ideas by public officials. So it would be unconstitutional for there to be discrepancies between racial groups above a threshold, and unconstitutional for politicians to hold racist ideas. How would this be enforced?" He proposed the creation of a new department, the Department of Anti-Racism, to be enshrined in the Constitution. I will read to you the powers he proposes that this body would have, but I'm going to give it a rebadge. I'm going to call it the Voice. The Voice to Congress would be comprised of formally trained experts on racism. The Voice would be responsible for pre-clearing all local, state and federal public policies to ensure they won't yield racial inequity. The Voice would monitor public officials for expressions of racist ideas. The Voice would be empowered with disciplinary tools to wield over and against policymakers and public officials who do not voluntarily change their racist policy and ideas. Now, Kendi's proposal has been roundly and rightfully criticised as being undemocratic, unmeritocratic, authoritarian, and Orwellian, the idea of policing ideas. One commentator, Coleman Hughes, a critic of Kendi's, has written, "Make no mistake, if totalitarianism comes to the West, it won't be the fascism or communism of the 20th century, it will be the anti-racism of folks like Kendi." Now, is it fair of me to compare the Voice, to compare Kendi's fantasy with the very real proposal to have a voice to Parliament in our Constitution? Well, I think it would be a fair comparison if the Voice meets three preconditions. Those preconditions are: 1, it must have a degree of binding political power. 2, it must push an activist racial agenda. And 3, there would have to be a breakdown of ordinary democratic norms for such an undemocratic institution to be tolerated. Unfortunately, the research the Institute of Public Affairs has done suggests that all three are a possibility. Let's start with our research on New Zealand. Why New Zealand? On the 6th of February 2020, Anthony Albanese posted the following statement to Twitter: "We can learn a lot from our mates across the ditch about reconciliation with First Nations people. New Zealand has led the way. It's time for Australia to follow. It's time to support the Uluru Statement from the Heart." So, according to our Prime Minister, the path forward is the New Zealand path. The IPA thought we'd see where that path led. It led us to Casey Costello. There's a video with me and Casey. I interviewed Casey, hopefully out this week. Casey is a New Zealand Maori woman who has been a strong critic of the racial policies adopted in New Zealand over the past 40 years. In Casey's words, New Zealand is no longer a democracy, it is an ethno-state. Race permeates all aspects of politics. Your race determines how you can vote, what say you get in politics, what role you can play in politics, what services you receive, and what you pay for them. New Zealand is a nation divided by race. It is two nations in one. They even have a word for it, co-governance. And it all started with an advisory body. In 1975, the Waitangi Tribunal was set up to investigate Maori grievances and make recommendations to Parliament. Sound familiar? Then in a court case in 1987, it was held that its decisions should be considered binding on the government. Let that sink in. In 12 years, it went from an advisory body to being binding on the government. But, John, that's New Zealand. Things are different over there. They've got that Waitangi Treaty thing. It's different to Australia. Well, it's true, we don't have a Waitangi Treaty, but we do have the High Court of Australia. Over the last few decades, our High Court has been very adept at discovering new powers, rights, privileges in our Constitution, just waiting to be discovered by them. They discovered native title in the Mabo case. They discovered the Constitution has an implied right of political communication, a First Amendment without the messy process of actually amending the Constitution. They discovered the Constitution prevents prisoners serving less than 3 years from being denied the vote in national elections. I don't believe it was a coincidence that the claimant in that case was an Aboriginal woman serving a term of 3 years in prison. And the High Court discovered that a New Zealand citizen with Aboriginal ancestry could not be deported despite serving an 18-month prison sentence for domestic violence. According to one judge, this was because the person had a metaphysical connection to Australia. This is the High Court that will interpret the role, scope and power of the voice. How long before they discover that the voice is binding or entitled to a fixed budget or has investigatory powers similar to the other chambers of Parliament or has a veto over certain legislation? Back to the Waitangi Tribunal. What sort of decisions has it made? Well, since being granted binding power, it has never failed to push an activist racial agenda. Our research has uncovered a number of cases. I'll go through a few of them. They have held that Maori have a veto over certain legislation. They've held that resources, particularly health resources, should be allocated on the basis of race. They've held that Maori should get a say in negotiating international trade agreements, something that no other racial group has purely for being a member of that group. They've held that Maori should have their own health system, leading to the Maori Health Authority. They've held that Maori should have a monopoly of the use of iconic cultural symbols, everything from the haka to the kiwi bird. And they've held that Maori incarceration rates must be reduced relative to non-Maori incarceration rates in accordance with, I quote, fixed targets. The implication is clear. In the application of New Zealand's criminal laws, the race of the perpetrator must be taken into account and some violent criminals will not be sent to prison. This is anti-racism in action. Different laws for different people. Different laws for different races. In effect, the Waitangi Tribunal interprets the Treaty of Waitangi indistinguishably from how Ibrahim X. Kendi would do it. Any discrepancy in outcomes between Maori and non-Maori New Zealanders are treated as a breach of the Waitangi Treaty that must be redressed by the government. So the New Zealand voice to Parliament has two of the three preconditions I set out: binding political power and the pushing of a radical racial agenda. What about that third one, the undermining of democratic norms? Well, I think we are seeing that in Australia with this very referendum debate. Firstly, the tone of the debate. Anti-voice advocates have been called everything from racists, rednecks, to eugenicists. For example, when the government announced the cancellation of the referendum pamphlet, their stated reason for doing so was that they would not fund racism. So apparently no criticism of the Voice, not even a 2,000-word information pamphlet, can be said against the Voice that would not constitute racism. Then there's unfair financial arrangements, the deductible gift recipient status that is granted to the yes case and not the no case. Now, then there's the multi-million-dollar taxpayer-funded Your Money funding an education campaign. Now, I'm sure this education campaign will be just as fair, balanced and neutral as the reporting of our national broadcaster. Speaking of which, part of this education campaign will be to target misinformation. They will no doubt use RMIT Fact Check, which is in partnership with the ABC. They might as well call it the Ministry of Truth. And then there is internet censorship. 2 of the videos that the IPA have released promoting our research on the Voice have been censored by the big tech platforms. And other anti-voice organisations have had the same problems. Now, it's not all bad. The IPA was one of the first to call out the scrapping of the referendum pamphlet as an attempt to silence the no case. And it does seem that the government has backflipped on that based on the announcements made today. Similarly, the IPA was the first organisation to call out the unfairness of giving deductible gift recipient status to the yes case, and it looks like there may be some movement on that as well. So we can push back at this, but overall, the current political debate must be one of the most unique in Western history. All the institutions of power have put their weight, whether it be financial or otherwise, behind the yes case. The legal profession, to my chagrin, academia, media, big tech, the sporting codes, woke corporations, the banks, and of course the government itself, and who knows, maybe the opposition, have all put their weight behind the Voice. But the few voices, such as the IPA and others, who are willing to put the other side forward, are readily denounced as racist. This is not a healthy state of affairs for a democracy. Will the Voice end up like Kendi's insane Department of Anti-Racism? I don't know. But I will finish on this thought. If the Voice can only succeed through emotional blackmail, personal slurs, unfair funding and censorship, even if it is successful, would it really represent reconciliation? Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. Anthony and John, would you like to join us up here? Before we go into Q&A, how about one more round of applause for 3 terrific speakers? Stuart, where's our first question on this side?
I wrote to my local federal member to ask why tax deductibility was not open to the no lobby. And he replied, the various lobbies have to apply for this deductibility. Is this true?
My understanding of this, and I've discussed it with Gary Johns, is there's various ways that application processes can run, but essentially it was done with a stroke of the pen by the federal government. So I think that's a bit of a dodge to say they did not, the yes case did not have to line up with everyone else at the counter at the ACNC and apply for its tax deductibility status. They were ushered to the front of the queue and everything was taken care of. And the challenge has been put to now to recognise a better way to apply, but we'll see how they go with it. So I think it's at best a half truth in that answer. I wouldn't say it's an outright fib, but yeah. Unless John, you had any deeper knowledge, or Amanda, of that.
There's 2 pathways to getting that status. One is to, as Scott's said, go through the usual processes that usually take a couple of years to achieve the outcome desired, or the government of the day has the power as an executive to very easily pop whoever they would like on the list. And that's clearly what's happened in relation to the yes case. Yeah. It has not happened in relation to the no case.
Indeed. And that's something we should be demanding, are demanding, in fact, right now. Thank you, Amanda. Question for Barclay.
Hi, panel. I just wanted to ask your opinion. Obviously, the primary issues of what we're trying to address with the Voice to Parliament are occurring in places like Alice Springs and Darwin. And I wanted to get the panel's opinion on alcohol-free zones. On one side, I want to say it's a breach of civil liberties. And on the other side, I want to say, well, perhaps they are working in curbing alcohol-fueled violence. So I wanted to get your guys' opinion on that. Thank you.
And I might start with Anthony, because you mentioned that you'd just come back from Alice Springs.
Yes, yeah, I was just up there. And I had a great time. I was out at a school with Best Price, helping with the kids out there. Look, they are a part of a solution, and the analogy I use is if you have a boat and you've got 10 holes in it, you need to patch up all the holes in order for it to work. You know, certainly patching up some holes will slow it down. So yes, the bans will slow things down, but other things are needed as well. So you do need to, as I said before, get adults working, because when they work, not only are they earning money, but they're earning a sense of self-worth as well. So, you know, if you had to put me into a corner as to whether I agree with them, I would say yes, the bans are needed as a circuit breaker, but we do need to be doing something else as well, you know, other programs as well.
Very good. Thank you, Anthony. Another question over here with Michael. Thank you, Stuart.
Thank you. Amanda, as a former Liberal senator and presumably still a member of the party, why is the Liberal Party having such a problem coming out against this proposal?
Thank you, Michael. Look, how do I put this? If they found it easier, I'd probably still be there. The expectation I have is that the instincts of the leader are good on this, but that he is trying very hard to keep a broad church together and to provide avenues by which everybody can land on the right side of this argument, which is to say no. You know, he's working in an environment where the person he has in the Shadow Attorney General's space that would ordinarily be responsible for this, a very honourable and decent and intelligent man in Julian Leeser, has also nailed his colours to the mast on this stuff a long, long time ago. So it's necessary for there to be a way to provide all of these different pockets of the party with the, I call it the permission structure, but the reasons by which they can come to the right answer. And I think that's the reason why it has been a slow process, but I remain optimistic that it will land in the right place.
As do we all. Thank you, Amanda. Question down the back there, Celia.
Thank you. Peter O'Brien. Two of the speakers mentioned that the voice is not the path to reconciliation. I would like to ask the members of the panel, what is reconciliation and what does it look like to them?
Yeah, look, it's something that's never really been clearly defined, but to me it is two groups getting on, and largely they are. And so, you know, living with, alongside each other, doing well together. And of course, having the people on one side, the Indigenous people, having a similar standard of health and well-being to non-Indigenous people. And as we know, we've already achieved that, a lot of that. There's that minority who are, you know, in the thousands who are suffering. So total reconciliation will entail closing the gap, having all Indigenous people have the same opportunities as what most non-Indigenous people have. I think that's what reconciliation would look like, because we've already got a lot of it, getting along, into marriage, living beside each other, all that sort of thing.
Look, I think Anthony's right in what he said. To that, I'd add two things, though. There's a difference between equality of opportunity and equality of outcome. We cannot and we should not, but we will never be able to provide completely equal outcomes for all Australians in all aspects of life. It's not achievable, and it would be quite tyrannical to try. But if we can create an environment where people who want to have a genuine shot at achieving their goals in life, and on the measures that Anthony's referred to, they're starting from a pretty level playing field, then we're doing quite well. Well, we do, I think, in urban areas. I do think it is a bit tougher in some of those remote places. But as I mentioned in my speech, not all of that's about race. A lot of that's about geography. A lot of that's about place. And so we need to make sure that we aren't giving a racial character to things that aren't necessarily in that category. Okay. The only other thing I'd add, I beg your pardon, John, I'll be quick, is to say no one has ever told us what reconciliation looks like. We don't know what the destination is. And it would be very helpful, I think, to have a mapped out plan for what that looks like. Now, saying every business has a reconciliation action plan, and my children's childcare wants to tell me about the reconciliation action plan for my children to be reconciled. I'm like, oh golly. I don't mean it in that sense. But in practical terms, if we can, as a nation, say, this is what it will look like when this process is done, then I think there's the opportunity to have all Australians move forward in good faith towards a state where there is that kind of mutual respect that transcends the colour of anyone's skin.
Indeed. Yep. Okay. Thank you. Sorry, John.
Similar to what Amanda said, I think the question should be directed to the activists in favour of the voice. When would they ever be satisfied? Mm-hmm. And I expect the answer is never.
Okay. Well put.
Can I just add one more thing to that? Even though we're not quite sure what reconciliation is, whatever it is, we know that when you have reporting like we saw the ABC do about that meeting in Alice Springs, it's going to hinder reconciliation.
Indeed. Adrian has a question here, and then there's one in the front row over there. Sorry, this is Adrian here. I beg your pardon.
Sorry, Adrian.
Yep.
Thank you very much. So I'm aware that Lydia Forbes is actually against the voice. So how do you feel that you guys are basically strange bedfellows? And do you actually buy her arguments against the voice, even if they are going to lead to exactly what you wouldn't want, which is a treaty?
As a military historian, I'll just remind us that we were once allied with Stalin.
Well said.
The enemy of my enemy.
I'll give Lydia Thorpe this credit. She's been honest. She's been honest with Australians about what she wants to achieve and why. Anthony Albanese and the people he has drafted to help push this agenda want exactly the same thing. They're just not being upfront about it. And if you look at the whole of the program they have in mind, the Voice to Parliament is just the first step. Don't forget, there's also to be treaty, as you've mentioned, and truth. And the truth aspect is really quite Orwellian. The idea that you could have something of a permanent court set up in which Aboriginal people can come and tell their version of history without any critical cross-referencing or need for evidence, and allow for that kind of revisionist approach to happen in an uncritical way, is a pretty scary thing, actually. So I at least give Lydia Thorpe credit for honesty. she's up front. She is what she is, and that can't be said for the Prime Minister and his little crew.
Indeed.
I have one concern about that. With Lydia opposing the voice, I'm fearful that thousands of people are going to vote for it now.
Very good. And question over here. So.
Sophie York, thank you very much, panel. This is so fascinating. I have a threefold question. The first is there are apparently 11 Indigenous parliamentarians at present, so they sound quite well represented. And there's also the NIAA, that's being the National Indigenous Australians agency, that's being funded to the tune of $2 billion a year. So it sounds like they're quite well covered with respect to a voice. So surely for consistency, we should be agitating for groups that don't have a voice, such as disabled, the migrant community and so forth. Not a comparable voice. Secondly, will the voice be, the selection of members on it, will they be democratically selected? And thirdly, under Section 75 of the Constitution, anyone can get a writ of mandamus or prohibition against an officer of the Commonwealth. Will all the members of the voice become, if it's included in the Commonwealth, the Constitution, will they become officers of the Commonwealth? And if so, does that mean that any Australian at any point can take out a writ of mandamus or prohibition against the voice, thereby paralysing our government? And that person could perhaps even be an everyday person or a cabinet minister, and that would take it into litigation territory and stop government. Do you have a comment to make about that threefold question?
Can I interpolate Chairman's prerogative? I want to amplify the second one, Sophie. I wrote a piece for the Daily Telegraph in the very early days of this, and in the absence of knowledge, I pointed out the scenario essentially of what I called the extra vote. This idea that we all have two votes today. We vote in the House of Representatives and the Senate, and essentially what would be proposed is a third vote, as in fact happens in Victoria, as in fact is happening in South Australia with their First Nations assemblies, I think they're called. And I have fundamental objections to that, but little was I to know as we dived into the Karma-Langton report that is not in fact what is on the table at all. It is not, in fact, a proposal to allow for a vote. But perhaps, Amanda, or have you dived into the weeds of the Karma-Langton report, which is, to this moment, the only report that the Prime Minister has referred us to for any kind of information about how the members of the Voice would be selected?
Yeah, I have, and while I'm not confident that it's necessarily the model that the government would go for in the event that their referendum got up. It's all we've got to work with at present. They're not actually proposing that these things be determined using a consistent methodology nationwide. They'd be allowing things to be tailored to different places and spaces. But it's not a given that these representatives would be elected. There's the prospect of them being appointed well, that's a good question. And there's also the prospect that they might be selected, but not using what we would call a democratic method by local communities. So it might be appointment by a group of elders, or one of those types of arrangements, rather than a one vote, one value kind of democratic process. So that's something quite interesting. In relation to your question about officers of the court, officers of the Commonwealth, I think they'd have to be. They'd have to be officers of the Commonwealth, because if you think about the comparable positions that fall into that category, they are officers. So,
yep, which opens up as Rex Mossop would say, a hornet's nest of worms. So, John. And then one more question over there.
I'll just address your first part of your question about different groups wanting a voice. If this referendum is successful, it's an admission that our democratic system doesn't work, because there's a group of people for whom they aren't properly represented and require a special rule to address that. Why is that limited to one group? Once you admit that our current constitution, one of the oldest written constitutions in the world, isn't working, then why should anyone else accept it?
No,
Just where identity politics takes you.
Yep, identity politics in action. Last question from Philip, and then, as I mentioned, we will have the opportunity for further discussions outside. Philip.
The native title regime has been implemented. Has that contributed towards the success of Aboriginal people, or does it keep them down on the farm?
I can say things about that, but do you want to have a whirl first?
No, look, short answer, no. I don't know too much about it, but it's, for whatever reason, it's, whether there's too many fingers in the pie or whatever, or mismanagement or whatever. I can't say that it's made any difference.
I think it's actually caused some problems. It was well intentioned, as so many things in this space are, but providing a communal system of land ownership actually stops native title holders from being able to aspire to the same things that you and I do. They can't get a mortgage from the bank and use it to build a house in which they can build their pride and joy and keep their family safe. They can't go and get a business loan to set up a business on their native title lands and turn it into a commercial district with which they could provide prosperity for all of their local people. Native title reform, in a way that allows native title holders to do something with it, is probably the most meaningful thing we could do to improve the empowerment of people in these remote places. One final thing I'll say on the subject before I wrap it up is to say one of the interesting dynamics we've had in recent times is that while there are around 40,000 native title holders or native title applicants, I'm putting a very broad definition of native title holders there, right, in this country, there's now many, many multiples of that, 700,000 of people who identify but aren't native title holders. And that number of people who are identifying as Aboriginal, or less so Torres Strait Islander, in each census is increasing and increasing. That tells us something perhaps about better awareness and understanding and the ability of people to access their histories. But I suspect a big factor in it too is that we have incentivised people to get advantages based on race in a way that means people who actually don't have that same native title connection are availing themselves of. And when we have to ask ourselves, what are the social inputs that are driving towards that? I have no problem with people who are wanting to connect with their Aboriginal background. That's great. But we do need to ask whether that's based on a solid appreciation of an impressive culture, or whether that's about extracting certain benefits from a government that has gone down an identity politics path.
I want to thank you all for coming, because you do have that interest, you share that interest, and we all share the view that race has no place in the Constitution. Thank you for coming.